Number 1.
A burned body. Multiple identities used to check into hotels. 2 suitcases full of wigs and clothes without tags. The mystery of Norway's Isdal woman is now over 50 years old, but investigators and journalists have made little progress in figuring out who she was and who killed her. DNA testing performed in recent years has yet to yield database matches. Was she a spy? A member of an international criminal organization? Or did she suffer from a mental illness? Those are among the theories surrounding the case, which was investigated in Norway with the assistance of police agencies in Europe. The woman's body was discovered November 29, 1970, by a man and his 2 young daughters while hiking in Isdalen, a remote wooded valley outside the city of Bergen, in western Norway. Isdalen means ice valley. The front of her body, including her face and most of her hair, were burned. Next to the body, police found jewelry, bottles with the labels scrapped off a watch and an umbrella. Police also found the remains of nylon stockings and rubber boots. The placement and location of the objects surrounding the body was strange. Tormod Bones, one of the forensic investigators, told the BBC in 2017. It looked like there had been some kind of ceremony. The woman was described as about 5 foot 4 1/2 inches tall, with brown eyes and long dark hair. She appeared to be between 25 and 40 years old. She had distinctive teeth, with 14 fillings and several gold crowns, unusual for her age and atypical for Norway. An autopsy concluded she died from a combination of sleeping pills and carbon monoxide poisoning, which may have been from a campfire next to her. There are conflicting reports as to whether there was, in fact, a fire close to her. Her death was deemed a probable suicide, but many are skeptical due to the odd circumstances surrounding the case. Police found 2 suitcases at Bergen railway station's luggage department that were traced back to the dead woman, thanks to a fingerprint. The contents included glasses, clothes with tags that had been cut off, wigs and German and Norwegian money, along with Belgian, British and Swiss coins. There was a notepad with rows of handwritten letters and numbers. Eventually investigators figured out they indicated the dates and places where she had stayed, all written in code. There was a plastic bag from a footwear store in the city of Stavanger, Norway, about 120 miles south of Bergen. The owner's son remembered that the woman had purchased rubber boots. She was well-dressed and nice-looking, he told the BBC. She was a customer who took up space, asked a lot of questions, and spent a long time making up her mind. Her English was poor, and I remember a certain peculiar scent that might have been garlic, he told NRK Radio in Norway. The police traced the woman to a local hotel, where she'd registered as Fenella Lorch. But that was not a real name, nor were the other aliases she used to stay at several other hotels throughout Norway from March to November 1970. Genevieve Landseer, Claudia Tielt, Claudia Nielsen, Alexia Zarn Merches, Vera Jairl and Elizabeth Leenhofer. Presumably, the woman would have had to show fake passports to check into the hotels. However, no passports were ever found, only a nearly destroyed plastic cover, possibly for a passport, near her body. Hotel staff remembered her as fashionable, quiet and serious. She spoke poor English as well as German and Flemish. One waitress remembered her dining next to 2 German Navy personnel, including an officer. Despite what appeared to be a lot of clues, investigators were not able to figure out the woman's identity. Norwegian authorities ordered the case closed in early 1971, just a few weeks after the discovery of the body. They buried the Isdal woman in a zinc coffin to preserve her remains in case relatives come forward in the future. The mystery has received renewed interest in recent years. A new notice about the Isdal woman was issued in 2017 by Interpol, the International Criminal Police Organization. NRK Radio's Merit Higraff and BBC's Neil McCarthy re-examined the case with the cooperation of Bergen Police and the National Criminal Investigation Service, called Kripos, in Norway. An analysis of the enamel on the Isdal woman's teeth showed she most probably spent her childhood somewhere along the border between France and Germany. Around age 14, she probably lived in the border areas of Germany, France, Luxembourg and Belgium. Her age was deemed closer to 40 than 30. At the time of her body's discovery, some among local police were reluctant to let the case go and believed it was closed too soon, their descendants said. Some speculated the case may have been closed because it had larger implications if in fact the woman was a spy or somehow connected to intelligence work. "My father could never put this case away," Tor Osland, the son of Bergen investigator Harold Osland, told the BBC. "He never could accept that they had to close down the case." The granddaughter of a Bergen police officer, Cecily Thorsted Flo, said the case broke her grandfather's trust in his profession. "My grandfather had this feeling that barriers were being put on their work," she said.
Number 2.
On a sweltering day on June 30, 1999, the body of a 41-year-old Ricky McCormick was found sprawled out in a dark, desolate cornfield in St. Charles County, Missouri. Strangely, there had been no missing persons reports filed for the man at the time, no police report, and indeed no one had really seemed to have noticed that he had been gone at all. It became clear later that he had last been seen alive 5 days earlier, on June 25, 1999, getting a health checkup at Forest Park Hospital in St. Louis, but that was the extent of what anyone knew. The only reason the corpse had even been found at all was because a passing driver just happened to stumble upon it as she drove by along an empty rural stretch of nearby Route 367. It would turn out that the body had been in the field long enough that it had rotted and decomposed down to the point where he had to be identified by fingerprints. An unemployed high school dropout with 4 illegitimate children and a criminal record, it was perhaps understandable that McCormick could have managed to sort of slip under the radar and disappear without being noticed, yet the odd mysteries behind his death and the discovery of the body were just beginning. The first oddity was the fact that the abandoned field where the body was found was nearly 20 miles from where McCormick had lived on and off with his elderly mother, despite the fact that he had not had a car nor a driver's license, and there were no bus lines or public transportation of any kind that stopped in that bleak and empty rural area. This led police to suspect possible foul play, perhaps linked to a shady past that turned up to paint him as a drug dealer and a felon for sexual abuse. It seemed that there were perhaps reasons for someone to want him dead, but there were no leads as to who might have committed the crime, no clear motive, and no physical evidence that he had even been murdered at all, as the coroner was unable to find any signs of gunshot or knife wounds on the badly decomposed body, and McCormick was found to have had a history of chronic heart and lung problems. The death was deemed suspicious, but that was about as far as authorities could get at the time. The mysteries continued with the discovery of 2 handwritten notes in McCormick's pockets, which would only puzzle authorities even more. The notes contained a series of cryptic codes composed of a mishmash of a randomly arranged gibberish of letters and numbers, occasionally punctuated with parentheses, childishly scrawled across the crumpled-up paper, the meaning of which was a complete mystery. Analysis by FBI's Cryptanalysis and Racketeering Records Unit, CRRU, as well as the American Cryptogram Association turned up nothing, and the codes remained an absolute enigma. Making things even more bizarre is that the existence of these puzzling notes with their unbreakable cipher was kept secret and not announced to the public until March 29, 2011, a full 12 years after the death had taken place, and even then it was only released by frustrated authorities in an effort to appeal to anyone out there who might be able to crack the code and its meaning, believing that they were the key to discovering what had happened to the victim. Not even the family of the victim had been informed of the notes. It was at this time that it became clear from comments by McCormick's family that there was no way that he could have been the one to write the notes in their bizarre code. The family claimed that Ricky had been almost completely illiterate, barely able to even write his own name, let alone strange cryptic messages, and even his own mother described him as retarded. In the meantime, the FBI was so deluged with comments and theories about the code from the public that they set up a separate website just to deal with them all, yet the messages continued to stump everyone, and they still do. The notes found on the body of this seemingly forgotten criminal, whom no one had seemed to even notice was gone, became the object of intense scrutiny by amateur code breakers and armchair sleuths, who offered up a myriad of speculation and theories on what they could mean, ranging from the idea that they were the meaningless, insane rantings of a schizophrenic individual to the notions that the notes were planted by drug dealers and were shorthand for a deal, or even that the whole thing was part of a sinister government conspiracy. Just about the only thing that many seem to agree on is that McCormick likely did not write the notes himself, although the FBI has said that they believe he very well may have. In the end, even after all of the years of debate, analysis and scrutiny, no one really knows what the code says. Ricky McCormick's death, as well as the identity of who wrote the notes, for what purpose, and what they mean, all remain a complete mystery that has baffled the FBI and thousands of amateur investigators for nearly 20 years. The only one who could possibly know the answers to any of the many questions surrounding this death is McCormick himself, but those secrets died along with him in that empty cornfield years ago. The death of Ricky McCormick remains to this day one of the most puzzling cold case murders there is, and its mysterious code one of history's most perplexing unsolved ciphers.
Number 3.
A Boeing 727 parked at 4 de Fevereiro Airport in Luanda, Angola, was boarded by 2 men in 2003. The plane took off and disappeared, and to this day, it has never been found. The airplane had once been in service with American Airlines for 25 years, but after being acquired by different parties, it ended up sitting on the tarmac of an Angolan airport for 18 months starting in 2002. Right before sunset on May 25, 2003, Ben Charles Padilla, an aircraft mechanic, private pilot, and certified flight engineer, and Mikkel Mutantu, a mechanic from the Republic of the Congo, boarded the Boeing 727-223, tail number N844AA. The airplane was taxied onto the runway at 4 de Fevereiro International Airport and made no contact with the air traffic control tower of the airport. The aircraft had its lights off and departed the airport heading southwest over the Atlantic Ocean. The transponder was also off, which would have identified the airplane with altitude and position information. The plane had been filled with 14,000 gallons of fuel, enabling it to be flown up to 1,500 miles. The aircraft mysteriously disappeared, and no debris or trace of N844AA or the 2 men were ever found. The Boeing 727-223 had been leased in 2002 from a Florida-based company called Aerospace Sales and Leasing by a man named Keith Irwin. Irwin had planned for the airplane to be fitted with diesel fuel tanks in the fuselage to supply fuel to diamond mines in Angola. But the deal fell through, and Irwin made only 2 payments on the airplane and defaulted. Padilla and Mutantu had been hired by Maury Joseph, the president of Aerospace Sales and Leasing, to work on the plane to bring it back up to flight-ready status. But neither man was certified to fly the airplane, and a 727 required 3 certified crew members. After the airplane disappeared, it set off an immediate search by U.S. security organizations because of the possibility the plane could have been used for a terrorist operation. When the disappearance took place, it had been less than 2 years after the attacks of 9/11. United States intelligence agencies, along with the FBI, began investigating why the plane was taken. No clear reasons why the theft took place were discovered. Many theories were proposed, and one that seemed the most plausible was that it had been taken for insurance reasons. The 727 had been sitting idle at the airport for 18 months and racked up over $4 million in unpaid fees. Maury Joseph, who had just lost on the leasing deal with Irwin and still owned the airplane, was thought by investigators to be engaging in an insurance fraud scheme. In addition, Joseph had previously been charged in the 1990s by the Securities and Exchange Commission for falsifying financial statements and defrauding investors. But the FBI eventually cleared him of any wrongdoing in the disappearance of the 727. Another theory posed was that Padilla stole the airplane so it could be ferried to another location to be scavenged and sold for parts. A friend of Padilla said that it was flown to Tanzania's western border and disassembled there, though no evidence was ever found that any of that took place. And still, there were other theories. One proposed that the airplane crashed into the Atlantic after takeoff, another that the Angolan Air Force shot it down, and one that the 727 made it north to Congo and crashed. No evidence of debris ever surfaced if the plane had crashed, and there was no evidence that it landed at any runway around Angola or in a neighboring country. There was also no evidence of the two men that reportedly had piloted the aircraft. The investigation into the theft of 844 AA slowly subsided, and the FBI closed its investigation in 2005. So what could have happened to 844 AA? As of now, no one knows why the plane was taken in the first place and where it might have gone.
Number 4.
In January of 1959, 9 young Soviet hikers died under mysterious circumstances while trekking through the Ural Mountains in what's now known as the Dyatlov Pass incident. In January 1959, a 23-year-old hiker named Igor Alexeyevich Dyatlov led a journey to reach the peak of Atortin, a mountain in the northern Urals of Soviet Russia. The young man brought a team of 8 experienced hikers, many from the Ural Polytechnical Institute, along with him for the adventure. Before he left, Dyatlov had told his sports club that he and his team would send them a telegram as soon as they returned. But that telegram was never sent, and none of the hikers of the so-called Dyatlov Pass incident were ever seen alive again. When their bodies were found in the coming weeks, their strange and gruesome injuries left investigators baffled and repulsed. Some were missing eyes, another was missing her tongue, and many were struck by a force comparable to that of a speeding car, but no one could make sense of it. The Soviet government closed the case quickly and offered only thin explanations, saying that the hikers died due to hypothermia because they were inexperienced and that maybe something like an avalanche was at fault. But with that explanation clearing up almost none of the lingering questions, amateur sleuths have been puzzling over the mystery of the Dyatlov Pass incident for the last 60 years. And while the Russian government did reopen the case in 2019, we still don't know exactly what happened on that snowy mountainside all those years ago. Based on what was recovered from cameras and diaries discovered at the site of the hikers' deaths, investigators were able to piece together that on February 1st, the team began to make their way through the then unnamed pass leading to Atortin. As they pushed through the hostile climate toward the base of the mountain, they were hit with snowstorms that ripped through the narrow pass. Decreasing visibility caused the team to lose their sense of direction, and instead of moving toward Atortin, they accidentally deviated west and found themselves on the slope of a nearby mountain. This mountain is known as Kalat Syakhl, meaning dead mountain in the language of the indigenous Mansi people of the region. To avoid losing the altitude they had gained, or perhaps simply because the team wanted to practice camping on a mountain slope before their ascent of Atortin, Dyatlov called for camp to be made there. It was on this solitary mountainside that all 9 hikers of the Dyatlov Pass incident would meet their demise. When February 20 rolled around and there was still no communication from the hikers, a search party was mounted. The volunteer rescue force that trekked through the Dyatlov Pass found the campsite but no hikers, so military and police investigators were sent in to determine what had happened to the missing team. When they arrived on the mountain, the investigators weren't hopeful. Though the group was made up of experienced hikers, the route they had chosen was remarkably difficult, and accidents on these tricky mountain trails were a real danger. With the hikers having been missing for so long, investigators expected to find an open and shut case of a horrific accident on treacherous ground. They were only partially correct. They found bodies, yet the state in which the bodies were found only raised more questions. Starting on February 26, the discoveries of the bodies opened up the true mystery of the Dyatlov Pass incident that continues to this day. When investigators arrived at the campsite, the first thing they noticed was that the tent had been cut open in a way that soon proved to be from the inside and that it was nearly destroyed. Meanwhile, most of the team's belongings, including several pairs of shoes, had been left there at camp. They then discovered 8 or 9 sets of footprints from the team, many of them clearly made by people with either nothing, socks, or a single shoe on their feet. These tracks led to the edge of the nearby woods, almost a mile away from the camp. At the forest's edge, under a large cedar, the investigators found the remains of a small fire and the first 2 bodies, Yuri Krivonishenko, 23, and Yuri Doroshenko, 21. Despite temperatures of 13 to 22 degrees Fahrenheit on the night of their deaths, both men's bodies were found shoeless and wearing only underwear. They then found the next 3 bodies, those of Dyatlov, Zinaida Kolmogorova, 22, and Rustam Slobodin, 23, who died on their way back to the camp from the cedar tree. While the circumstances were odd, investigators found that the causes of death were clear. All the hikers, they said, had perished from hypothermia. Their bodies showed no indication of severe external damage beyond what had been inflicted by the cold. However, this didn't explain why Doroshenko was brown-purple in complexion, or why he had gray foam coming from his right cheek and gray liquid coming from his mouth. Furthermore, this didn't explain why the hands of the two hikers under the cedar were scraped away and the branches above them were torn down, as if the two men had tried desperately to seek shelter from something or someone in the tree. Meanwhile, Slobodin had head injuries consistent with someone falling and hitting their head over and over again, and Kolmogorova had a baton-shaped bruise on her side. These two hikers, as well as the others found by this point, were also generally underdressed and wearing some of each other's clothes, only supporting the idea that they'd fled suddenly and without adequate preparation into the freezing night, despite being experienced hikers. It wasn't until the other four bodies were found 2 months later that the mystery deepened even more. The remaining hikers were discovered buried under the snow in a ravine 75 meters deeper into the woods than the cedar, known as the Dyatlov Pass Den, and their bodies told even more gruesome stories than those of the other members of the group. Nikolai Thibault-Brignals, 23, suffered significant skull damage in the moments before his death, while Lyudmila Dubinina, 20, and Semyon Zolotaryov, 38, had major chest fractures that could only have been caused by an immense force comparable to that of a car crash. In the most gruesome part of the Dyatlov Pass incident, Dubinina was missing her tongue, eyes, part of her lips, as well as facial tissue and a fragment of her skull bone. They also found the body of Alexander Kolevatov, 24, in the same location, but without the same kind of severe wounds. This second group of bodies suggested that the hikers had died at distinctly different times because they appeared to have been making use of the clothes of the people who died before them. Dubinina's foot was wrapped in a piece of Krivonischenko's wool pants, and Zolotaryov was found in Dubinina's faux fur coat and hat, suggesting he had taken them from her after she had died, just as she had taken clothes from Krivonischenko earlier. Perhaps most mysterious of all was that the clothes of both Kolevatov and Dubinina showed evidence of being radioactive. Due to evidence like this, even with more bodies found, the mystery of the Dyatlov Pass incident only grew more baffling. The Soviet government closed the case quickly and gave only vague causes of death and speculated that the hikers' own incompetence may have caused their demises or that a natural disaster was the culprit. Early on, many Soviets also suspected that the hikers' deaths were the result of an ambush by the local Mansi tribesmen. A sudden attack would account for the way the hikers fled their tents, their disarray, and the damage done to the second group of bodies. But that explanation fizzled quickly. The Mansi people were largely peaceful, and the evidence in the Dyatlov Pass didn't much support violent human conflict. For one, the damage done to the hikers' bodies exceeded the blunt force trauma one human could inflict on another. There was also no evidence of any footprints on the mountain beyond those made by the hikers themselves. Investigators then conceived of a swift, violent avalanche. The sound of snow collapsing, an early warning of the deluge to come, would have frightened the hikers out of their tents in a state of undress and sent them sprinting for the tree line. An avalanche would also have been powerful enough to inflict the injuries that killed the second group of hikers. But the physical evidence of an avalanche just wasn't there, and locals familiar with the terrain later said that such a natural disaster simply wouldn't have made sense in the Dyatlov Pass. There was also the fact that when investigators found the bodies, they noted no evidence that an avalanche had occurred any time recently in the region. There was no damage to the tree line, and searchers observed no debris. Moreover, no avalanches had been recorded at that site before, and nor have there been any since. Furthermore, would the experienced hikers have made camp in a spot that was vulnerable to an avalanche? The avalanche hypothesis was characteristic of most of the theories put forward in the early days of the mystery. It offered a quick, superficially plausible solution to some aspects of the puzzle, but utterly failed to account for others. With official theories leaving lots unexplained, many alternative explanations for the Dyatlov Pass incident have been put forward in the 6 decades since. While many of these are highly elaborate, some are decidedly concrete and straightforward. Some tried to explain the hikers' strange behavior and lack of clothing with an in-depth look at the effects of hypothermia. Irrational thinking and behavior is a common early sign of hypothermia, and as a victim approaches death, they may paradoxically perceive themselves to be overheating, causing them to remove their clothes. The trauma to the second group of bodies, in this version of events, is caused by a stumbling plunge over the edge of a ravine. Yet hypothermia doesn't explain why the hikers left their warm tents in a panic for the frigid world outside in the first place. Other investigators began to test the theory that the deaths were the result of some argument among the group that got out of hand, possibly related to a romantic encounter. There was a history of dating between several of the members that could explain some of the lack of clothes. But people who knew the ski group said they were largely harmonious. Moreover, the Dyatlov hikers would have been no more able to inflict the damage to their compatriots than the Mansi. The force involved in some of the deaths was, again, greater than that which any human could inflict. With humans effectively ruled out as the culprits behind the Dyatlov Pass incident, though there are theories that the KGB or murderous prison escapees were at fault, some began to posit non-human assailants. Some began to claim that the hikers were killed by a menk, a kind of Russian Yeti, to account for the immense force and power necessary to cause the injuries to 3 of the hikers. This theory is popular among those who focus on the damage to Dubinina's face. While most explain her missing tissue by positing a visit from small scavengers, or perhaps decay resulting from her partial submersion in a watery under-snow stream, menk proponents see a more sinister predator at work. Other sleuths point to the reports of small amounts of radiation detected on some of the bodies, leading to wild theories that the hikers had been killed by some sort of secret radioactive weapon after stumbling into secret government testing. Those who favor this idea stress the strange appearance of the bodies at their funerals. The corpses had a slightly orange, withered cast. But had radiation been the cause of death, more than modest levels would have registered when the bodies were examined. The corpse's orange hue isn't surprising given the frigid conditions in which they sat for weeks. They were partially mummified in the cold. The secret weapon explanation is popular because it is partially supported by the testimony of another hiking group, one camping 50 kilometers from the Dyatlov Pass team on the same night. This other group spoke of strange orange orbs floating in the sky around Cipher, a site proponents of this theory interpret as distant explosions. The hypothesis goes that the sound of the weapon drove the hikers from their tents in a panic. Half-clothed, the first group died of hypothermia while attempting to take shelter from the blasts by waiting near the tree line. The second group, having seen the first group freeze, determined to go back for their belongings, but fell victim to hypothermia too, while the third group got caught in a fresh blast further into the forest and died from their injuries. Lev Ivanov, the chief investigator of the Dyatlov Pass incident, said, "I suspected at the time, and I'm almost sure now that these bright flying spheres had a direct connection to the group's death," when he was interviewed by a small Kazakh newspaper in 1990. Censorship and secrecy in the USSR forced him to abandon this line of inquiry. Other explanations include drug testing that caused violent behavior in the hikers and an unusual weather event known as infrasound, caused by particular wind patterns that can lead to panic attacks in humans because the low-frequency sound waves create a kind of earthquake inside the body. In the end, the hikers' deaths were officially attributed to a compelling natural force, and the case was closed. But in 2019, Russian officials reopened the case for a new investigation. This time, however, officials said they would only consider 3 theories: an avalanche, a snow slab, or a hurricane. And the case was once again closed with only a vague conclusion that no criminal activity was afoot. Investigators said in July 2020 that the hikers died of hypothermia after an avalanche of similar force pushed them out of their tent and into the cold. Still, the mystery remains unofficially unsolved. The mountainside in question was named the Dyatlov Pass in honor of the lost expedition, and a monument to the 9 hikers was erected in the Mikhailov Cemetery at Yekaterinburg. There lay the only people who will ever know the full truth of what happened that night in the Dyatlov Pass.